The offseason has begun. No news on Aaron Rodgers yet, but the Jets are making moves. We're talking the latest Jets roster transactions today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, March 10th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. Helps the channel out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Well, the offseason has begun unofficially for the New York Jets. There's still all kinds of buzz about the team potentially trading for future Hall of Famer Aaron Rodgers, but the Jets have made a few smaller moves over the last couple days, and that's what we're going to talk about on today's show. Now, the Jets and Baltimore Ravens agreed to a trade yesterday, bringing safety Chuck Clark to New York. Clark had been a member of the Ravens. The Jets give up a 7th-round pick for Clark, and Joe Douglas's trend of hating 7th-round picks and trading them all away continues. I think at this point, you have to say it's kind of a philosophical thing with Joe Douglas, where his viewpoint is that 7th-round picks usually don't pan out, and even if they do sometimes, your odds of hitting in the 7th round really aren't that much better than grabbing an undrafted free agent. And typically, in many cases, the guy you would have drafted in the 7th round anyway hits undrafted free agency, so you're able to get him anyway. It definitely feels like a philosophical thing that, if you can get anything of value for a 7th round pick, it's worth making the trade. And I don't think he's wrong about that. I think that, every study I've seen on this, every time somebody has crunched numbers on this, they've suggested that these late round picks are more valuable as trade chips than they are with the players you actually select with them. Now, it's a little bit different with early round picks, but late round picks, if you can get a quality starter for a late round pick, you're usually better off because, again, the guy you would have drafted in the 7th round, he might make it to undrafted free agency anyway, and even if he doesn't, the odds at that point in the draft are not very good. Now, there's always the dilemma of trading for a player who's about to be cut, and by all accounts, Clark was about to be cut by the Baltimore Ravens because they need to, like the Jets, they're kind of tied up against the salary cap. He's an obvious guy to cut because the Ravens last year made moves to get 2 safeties. They gave Marcus Williams a big free agent contract. Kyle Hamilton they drafted in the 1st round. So Clark's the odd man out of Baltimore. So when you make a trade, it's kind of a dilemma because on the one hand, you're giving up an asset for a guy who's going to be cut. And essentially you could get him anyway in free agency. On the other hand, there's no guarantee you'll be able to sign him in free agency. So you're getting certainty. You know that you're getting the player, and you're getting him on the contract he's got now. You don't have to give him a new contract. So that's the calculus that goes into the decision whether you make a trade or whether you wait for somebody to be cut. As far as this decision goes, I don't think it's that big of a deal for the Jets. I think that my view on it is probably neutral, leaning positive. I think it's a decent trade for the Jets. I think Clark, pretty solid player. And here's what I'll say about Chuck Clark. I just mentioned how the Ravens brought in Marcus Williams in free agency and drafted Kyle Hamilton. The Ravens essentially made big moves to replace Clark last year. They were essentially phasing him out, and he's managed to still maintain his playing time. So, that tells you something. He's an interesting fit for the Jets from the standpoint that, his reputation is being a guy who's better playing closer to the line of scrimmage, a guy who's maybe a little bit better in the box than playing deep. So this could play out a couple different ways. The first is that the Jets might end up playing more man coverage this year. You drop Clark into the box and you play man on the outside, and you certainly have the corners to play man with Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed. So maybe Clark's a guy who helps you a little bit more in the box. It could also be that the Jets are not bringing. I think a huge part of this is that Clark is probably brought in to replace LaMarcus Joyner. Yeah, I would imagine LaMarcus Joyner's gone after this move. LaMarcus Joyner, of course, in his 30s, very inconsistent last year. The year before, missed the entire season virtually due to injuries. What's striking about this, though, is that I feel like Clark's game, his skill set, is kind of similar to Jordan Whitehead. And Whitehead has kind of a reputation for being a guy who's a little bit better closer to the line of scrimmage. So it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure how well Whitehead and Clark complement each other. And if I didn't know better, I would wonder whether Clark was being brought in to replace Whitehead. But I get the sense that the Jets do like Jordan Whitehead quite a bit, probably more than I do. So I'm imagining Clark has been brought in to replace LaMarcus Joyner, and he's a pretty reasonable. He's got a pretty reasonable salary. The Jets, we know, needed to upgrade the safety position because Joyner and Whitehead, I don't think they were good as a tandem. I don't think that they fit well together. Now the question is, how well do Joyner and Clark fit? And we'll find out in the months ahead as we move towards the 2023 season. But I think if we're just talking about a pure value proposition, a 7th round pick for a guy who's probably going to be a starter for you, I think it's a decent move. Do I think it's a move that radically alters the trajectory of the New York Jets the way trading for Aaron Rodgers would? Well, of course not. That goes without saying. Is it a move that has some question marks to it? Sure. Is there a guarantee Clark's going to play well with the Jets? It's always a challenge when a guy moves to a new team, finds a new system, but I think it's a reasonable deal for the Jets. And they certainly needed to upgrade the safety position. And I do think he can be an upgrade on LaMarcus Joyner if that's the guy he was brought in to replace. The defense is very good for the Jets. The defensive line is deep. It's got a lot of talent. It has the one superstar player in Quinnen Williams. Has some high-end complementary players like John Franklin Myers. Maybe Carl Lawson's still in the mix. You've got some budding young talent in Jermaine Johnson and Bryce Huff. You got outstanding corners. We move away from the defensive line. Outstanding corner. Sauce Gardner already, probably a top 3 corner in the NFL. DJ Reed, maybe the best number 2 corner in the NFL. Two guys who were absolute lockdown corners for the Jets for most of last season. Michael Carter II in the slot quietly had an excellent season. The issues with the Jets were really in the middle of the field. They were linebacker and they were safety, and I think the Jets like these linebackers a little bit too much. CJ Mosley, of course, got the All-Pro and Pro Bowl nods. I don't think CJ Mosley was awful, but I certainly don't think he was an All-Pro. I question whether he was really a Pro Bowler. Quincy Williams is a guy who covers a lot of ground, makes a lot of big plays, but makes a lot of mistakes. And the safeties, they had some issues last year. I mean, there were some games where the safety play really hurt the Jets. I mean, that was especially true early in the season, and it was especially true late in the season. It was kind of like the bookends where the safeties were struggling for the Jets. Chuck Clark, hopefully he'll be an upgrade for New York. Not the biggest move the Jets will make this offseason, certainly. Maybe an under-the-radar move, and the Jets hope it will pay dividends. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue our talk about the early offseason moves from the New York Jets. We talked about a guy who's arriving. Well, some fans are going to be upset because a fan favorite is departing. Braxton Berrios was cut yesterday, and we'll break down what that means for the Jets as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat but don't want all the fat and calories? Then you've got to try a Built Bar. What makes these Built Bars so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate, and they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. Built makes these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. And what's better is that they're healthy. They're only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein for most bars. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years I've been telling you about ordering your Built Bars at Built.com. Well, it's still an option if you want to, but if you want them quicker, now you can go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club for Built Bars. So you can head to your nearest Walmart today, you can walk to the pharmacy section and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can get a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. If you're close to a Sam's Club, you can run in, you can grab a 13-bar box of flavors like brownie batter and churro. And you can also go to Built.com if you want to order your Built Bars that way. You can thank me later. Delicious Built Bars. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. We spent our first segment talking about a new member of the New York Jets. Now we're talking about a former member of the New York Jets, and that's Braxton Berrios, a guy who was a fan favorite. I'm sure that there were a lot of Jets fans who were disappointed, who were upset when they found out that Berrios had been cut. The Jets do save $5 million under the cap, however, by making this move. And I think it was a move the Jets had to make. There was a report that the Jets actually tried to restructure Berrios' contract, but they could not agree to the terms. So what that means is that the Jets asked him to take a pay cut. A restructure can manifest itself in a number of different ways. Sometimes what happens is your salary is converted to signing bonus. So essentially what that means is your salary is paid out during the season, and it's converted to signing bonus, and signing bonus is paid to you up front. So that means you don't have to wait until the fall and winter to get money. And the way that lowers your cap hit is essentially it cuts your immediate cap hit down, but it adds a proportional amount to a player's future cap hits in subsequent seasons. The other way to do it, though, is just to ask the player to take a pay cut, take less money. And it sounds like, based on the way it was phrased, it was not explicitly said this, the Jets asked Berrios to take a pay cut, and whatever they asked him to take the pay cut to was just not acceptable to him, so he's going to become a free agent. Berrios, of course, was an all-pro return guy back in 2021. He became a fan favorite that year. He developed some decent chemistry with Zach Wilson. He had a number of clutch catches. Unfortunately, did not carry over to 2022. He had some really bad moments. He made some errors in the punt return game, and he had a drop in Minnesota in the fourth quarter of the Jets' loss to the Vikings. It would have put them ahead. It was a fourth down play if he had held on to the ball. The ball was thrown a little bit behind him by Mike White, but still a ball I would say he should have caught. And that was really, if you look to the season, that was really the turning point. Because if he catches that ball, the Jets probably beat the Vikings. They probably go to 8-4. Who knows how the rest of the year plays out? Maybe they would have lost the next 5, instead of losing the last 6. But you have to wonder, whether that would have, getting a big road win in Minnesota, improving your record to 8-4, would that have impacted the Jets the rest of the way? That was the beginning of the spiral. I'm not blaming the collapse on Berrios in particular, but I'm just saying that play ended up being a really important play. And it was kind of frustrating because Berrios in 2021 got a reputation of being a guy who was always in the right place, a guy who always made the play. He was reliable. He was not so reliable this year. Now, a lot of his utility came from the kickoff return game. Last year, of course, he was a first-team All-Pro, but I think there were some signs of danger with that. I watched him return kicks, and think about Berrios as he's very fast. If he gets up to top speed and he finds the hole, he could take it the distance. The thing is, I don't think he's great at reading the blocks, so I think in 2021 there were a couple of plays where he just happened to hit the hole, and he was able to break a big return, but he doesn't, without reading your blocks well, frequently what happens is you just run full steam into a wall of coverage guys. And that's what happened more frequently. I would compare Berrios as a return guy kind of like Antonio Cromartie, because Cromartie was very similar in that way, is that if Cromartie got to a lane, he could take it the distance, or he could break a big run. He did that, you may remember, it was not a touchdown return, but a Jets wild card victory in the playoffs in 2010. It looked like they had lost. Adam Vinatieri had hit a 50-yard field goal with a minute left, and Cromartie broke a huge return to give the Jets life, and the Jets ended up winning that game. Unfortunately, Cromartie, well, if he found the breach, he could take it the distance. He was not very good at finding it. So I think this is something similar with Berrios. He just kind of regressed all around this year. Last year, he was a decent role player. He was a good backup slot receiver. You could count on him if there was an injury. He could step in and get a couple chain-moving receptions on third down. It just did not work at all for him this past season. He was a favorite of the coaching staff. In fact, he was a favorite of the last 2 coaching staffs. Adam Gase really liked to utilize him, probably to his own detriment. I mean, there was a game or two where Adam Gase featured Berrios in the game plan. I think part of the calculus is probably Berrios had a good relationship with Zach Wilson. They were friends off the field, but on the field they developed chemistry. The Jets kind of had a revolving door at the receiver position in 2021. Berrios was one of the few guys who was on the field consistently, and he and Zach Wilson, to the extent Zach Wilson was able to develop chemistry with any of his receivers, Berrios was one. And I do think there's something to the idea that chemistry matters in the receiver-quarterback relationship. And there are some guys who I feel like may not be great receivers if you put them in a different situation on a different team with a different quarterback, but playing with a certain quarterback becomes second nature to them. I mean, look at the New England Patriots all those years with Tom Brady, and not that I want to compare Tom Brady to Zach Wilson, but look at the receivers that he developed chemistry with. You could talk about Julian Edelman. Would Julian Edelman really have been great on another team? And yes, I understand there's an argument to be made that having a quarterback like Tom Brady makes a receiver look better than he is sometimes, but the way the New England offense worked, he needed to know where every receiver was going when they were going to that spot. It was an offense that was based on reading defenses. Both the receiver and the quarterback had to be on the same page. They had to be in sync with precision. And I just think that there's something to the idea. So that was the logic behind giving Berrios the big contract. And he also had a very good season in 2021. He showed he was a useful role player. Unfortunately, Berrios kind of regressed, and he was kind of the guy, kind of the player he was prior to 2021 in this past season. Prior to the, and I guess like the one of the warnings is that the Jets gave Berrios a contract off a career year, and it was a career year that really wasn't that special. Now, he was a very good kickoff return guy, but kickoff returns seem to become less and less relevant every year in the NFL. He posted career highs in receiving yards, but in those career highs, I mean, he had less receiving yards than Corey Davis in 2021, who played about half the season. He had less receiving yards than Keelan Cole. So there were clear warning signs that maybe this was not such a great idea. There were arguments to be made for and against bringing back Berrios, but I think that this one was kind of a no-brainer. I think at his current salary, for the Jets' needs right now at the moment, the fact that the Jets needed to clear cap space, this was kind of like the low-hanging fruit. They're going to have to make tough decisions ahead. And whether they get Aaron Rodgers will likely impact how much cap space they want to clear out. This one, I think, had to be done because essentially every thesis you had about Berrios, that he was a great kickoff return guy. Well, that did not pan out in 2021. That he could be a good gadget guy. Well, Mike LaFleur's gone. I think he kind of fit Mike LaFleur's system as a guy who you manufactured touches for to get in space. When Mike LaFleur's gone. His friendship with Zach Wilson on and off the field, his chemistry with Zach Wilson. Well, Zach Wilson's not going to be the quarterback anymore. So pretty much every rationale you had for giving Berrios that contract, and there was a counter to this. I'm not saying that it was a slam dunk that the Jets should have given Berrios that contract because there were plenty of warning signs. If you want to get on Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh for ignoring those warning signs, I can't really argue with you, but for where the Jets are right now, I think that this one, unfortunately, because I know he has got a lot of fans, but I think unfortunately this one was kind of a no-brainer. It was one that the Jets really had to do. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will continue this Friday show. We'll talk about a restructure the Jets made this week. CJ Uzomah. It doesn't really impact the team, but we'll explain the mechanics of it as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about Jets off-season moves. We've talked about a guy the Jets got rid of, Braxton Berrios. We've talked about a guy the Jets added. Let's talk about a guy who's staying, CJ Uzomah. The Jets, earlier this week, restructured his contract. This is the type of restructure I was talking about a little bit earlier. They took some of his base salary, so that's money that he gets paid after the games. And essentially your base salary divided into 17, you get a check after every game for your base salary. They converted that into signing bonus. So this is whenever you hear a player has restructured his deal, there's a tendency to think he's being a great team guy. But really what's happening in many of these cases, unless they're taking a pay cut, what's happening is that essentially they're converting their base salary into signing bonus, and signing bonus is paid immediately to one lump sum. So essentially what you're doing is you're getting more money up front. So most players are going to agree to that. And what it does is it clears short-term cap space. It clears out cap space this year in exchange for adding future obligations against the salary cap. And that's because the way signing bonus is calculated in the NFL is signing bonus, the cap hit is spread out over the lifetime of the contract. So it's divided equally. So if you give a player a $5 million signing bonus on a 5-year contract, he gets the $5 million up front, but the cap hit is spread out $1 million a year for each of the 5 years. And that's, that you can't take away the cap hit. There's really no way to restructure that in the future to eliminate the future cap hits that you take on for signing bonuses. So in some ways, like these restructures where you convert base salary to signing bonus, it's kind of like having a charge card or a credit card where essentially you're getting the benefit now, but you have to make the payments later on. That's kind of the way I think of it. Uzomah, I think, is the first of what will likely be many restructures for the Jets this offseason. And again, I think the pursuit of Aaron Rodgers will play into this. I think if the Jets go out and get Rodgers, you're going to see a lot of restructures. I think the Jets are all in the next 2 years if they get Rodgers. I'm sure that part of the deal is that Rodgers is going to want certain players to come in. I think it'll be one of those situations where, and you see this a lot more. You see this more in the NBA than in the NFL. Although in the NFL there are increasing cases of this where one star player has a hand in dictating personnel moves, and I would imagine that the Jets would give Rodgers that courtesy. I would imagine Rodgers probably wants some degree of say over personnel transactions, and I think the Jets probably would give it to him because I think the Jets really want Rodgers badly. So if the Jets get Rodgers, I think you'll see a lot more restructures. You'll see a lot of money, a lot more base salary converted into signing bonus. I think you'll see a lot more dead money pushed into the future for the Jets. And it's just the way things have to be. The way the Jets set up their structure for this season, well, the plan was for Zach Wilson to be the quarterback. The plan was to not be paying a lot for your quarterback position. The plan was to fill in the rest of the roster around him, to load up, And what happened? Well, the Zach Wilson era kind of fell apart when the Jets now need to spend to bring in a veteran quarterback. So now they need to create this cap space they had not budgeted for. They had budgeted very little money for quarterback. They had budgeted it all for the rest of the roster. Well, now with Zach Wilson gone and an expensive quarterback, more of a necessity, there needs to be a way to clear up cap space. And this is how they do it. It's CJ Uzomah, the first of what I believe will be many restructures for the Jets. The Jets cleared over $3 million in cap space. They also added what are known as void years to the end of the contract to kind of stretch out the cap hit a little bit further and clear up as much short-term cap space as they could. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.